your basic idea is that totalitarianism might be better adapted to this world that we find ourselves in the 21st century. And the core reason why is because, as you say, the internet or the cost of information has gotten very cheap, right? Whereas in the 20th century, maybe the cost to produce information was a lot higher. And so this technological shift of cheap information has really possibly given totalitarian, authoritarian regimes a fitness advantage, like kind of in this Darwinian struggle of which society is going to produce the most economic output. And so let's just reinforce that a little bit. This idea that liberal democracies are information aggregators. I think Bankless listeners will be more familiar with the idea of capital markets as information aggregators. There's there's that clip, that Milton Friedman pencil clip, where he talks about how it's from the 1980s, and we'll include a link in the show notes. But he basically holds up a pencil and he says, no single person knows how to make this pencil from scratch. And then he goes through all of the different components of the pencil, the graphite inside, the rubber, all of it sourced from different places in the world. And he makes the point that all of these things require specialized skills and labor. And so something as mundane as a pencil is really this unique creation of capitalism. And isn't it great that we can all coordinate around price systems and have market signals? We could do this without war. We could do this in a peaceful way. And so that is kind of like information aggregation theory as applied to capital. But what about applying that to democracies? So what about the idea that I think is core to your argument here, that liberal democracies are information aggregators, and so they have a superiority in their ability to aggregate information effectively, like leading to better decisions and like more buy-in in public goods? That wasn't necessarily clear to me going into this episode. Could you steel man that a little bit? Why are democratic liberal democracies information aggregators, and why have they in the 20th century had an advantage there?
Right. So I would direct you to Bruce Bueno de Mesquita's selectorate theory, which is a really interesting theory. The idea is in a democracy, right? So we have the same understanding of how markets aggregate information. But let's talk about democracies also aggregate information, just a different way. And so when you have, say you have two parties, right? And one party's like, I'm going to raise your taxes, I'm going to lower your tax. And the other party says, I'm going to lower your taxes. And the party that says, I'm going to raise your taxes says, okay, I'm going to raise your taxes and I'm going to buy you healthcare with that, right? And the other party's like, no, I'm going to lower your taxes and you can go buy your own healthcare if you want, or you can buy whatever you want. And so those are the two ideas on offer. And so the question is, well, what do the masses want, right? And so then you have people vote based on that. This is an incredibly simplified, stupid model, obviously, but this is the first model you learn in public economics because it's just illustrative, right? It's an illustrative example. And so then you have people vote on which of these they like better. Do you like the high tax, high services candidate? Or do you like the low tax, low services candidate better? And then you vote on them. And if more people want high tax, high services, they'll vote for that candidate. And if less people want it, they'll vote for the other candidate. And so then by voting, you aggregate information about what people want, about people's preferences. And this is, by the way, this is called the median voter theorem. You've heard of it. And so that's the idea of the median preference, gets into policy, because then the candidates do what they say they're going to do and everything works nice. And then you get your high tax, high service Denmark, or you get your low tax, low service, I don't know, Hong Kong, whatever it got. I know they didn't really have a democracy. Anyway, we can't use the United States for that anymore because we're not that anymore. But then, and Singapore is way different. But so there's no real libertarian, example I can use versus that. But this is how people used to talk about this. So that's how democracies aggregate information. Now, are democracies perfect information aggregators? Well, no. But neither are markets. There's reasons why this information aggregation fails. And so the idea that democracy is the least bad system, which is a famous Winston Churchill quote, this idea came from the idea that, well, when you have a totalitarian state, when you have, Nicolae Ceausescu is in charge, right? And nobody's like, he's like, oh, I'll ban abortion. I'll do these other things that he like thinks are right because he and his buddies think that, and his all his guys around him are like, that sounds legit. Let's do that. And then, then the normal people don't like it, and he's like, oh, well, okay, they bitch and moan, but it's just a few loud people, blah, blah, blah. But because you don't have the aggregation, because they can't vote for Ceausescu, and you can't see him punished at the polls, you can't see him thrown out, in favor of some other leader, blah, blah, blah. The leadership just doesn't realize what the people really want, and so does things that the people don't want, and then gets thrown out violently via revolution, which causes chaos in society, which leads to, problems. And so, although maybe in the long term, it's good, but then it's better if you can throw the bums out with an election than throwing them out by hanging them from a gas station and by burning the Capitol. And so that's the idea of democracies aggregating information about what voters actually want.
Vitalik, you put this into a pretty interesting metaphor that I kind of want to bring up in this point of the conversation. On Warpcaster, which is where we saw your interest in this article, you say this might be the strongest case for authoritarianism, and then you link to Noah's article. Basically, the war for people's hearts and minds has no stable equilibrium except local hegemony of one dominant elite, much like, and for the same reasons as, what Hobbes points out for regular war. And so this is Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan concept that I think you're alluding to. And you're saying Hobbes alludes to this idea. First, there's a global state of anarchy, and then there's a war against all, which suppresses the anarchy, which leads to a governing elite with a monopoly on force, which is kind of like how we have the stable equilibrium of countries to this day. And you allude to the fact that this produces a same pattern with instead of a state of physical anarchy, you have a state of information anarchy. And I think, again, alluding to the fact that like putting out a tweet is so cheap these days. And so the same pattern exists where like if we want truth, we kind of need a governing elite of a monopoly of memes is kind of how you say it. Maybe you could also just like add to this illustration of just like what happens when like information markets and capital markets interact with each other and how they can kind of get distorted and overall just how you resonated with Noah's article.
Yeah, and so I think you definitely gave a pretty good introduction to, I guess, the thesis already, right? But basically, if you think of like what the public discourse game is, and like you imagine the most pessimistic possible interpretation of the public discourse game, there is basically no truth seeking. And instead what you have is you have multiple tribes. And each of these tribes basically, fires off a type of, like missile or warship or like a tank or whatever. That's could be a meme or could be an article, could be a tweet or a video or whatever. And often, these a million of these info missiles fired at you would have some common themes. And so you have one group that's like basically trying to essentially have their memes colonize your brain. And then you have a different group that's also trying to have their memes that are completely different memes go and colonize your brain. And so you basically have this like zero-sum conflict, right? It's like, if we say, one side is pushing capitalism, the other side is pushing socialism, or if you say, let's say, it's a foreign policy issue, and like, let's say, Greenland and Sweden are at war, and you have one group saying support Greenland, and the other saying support Sweden, and like these are just like very zero-sum things, and like you have people pushing in one direction, you have people pushing in the other direction, and it basically all kind of roughly sums up to zero, and you just have like a huge amount of wasted effort, huge amount of stress, a huge amount of people not getting literally killed, but like definitely getting like much worse life emotional experiences than they otherwise would. And so you basically ask the question of like, okay, so you have this war of all against all that looks very similar to a war between two armies to conquer territory, except instead of it being two armies battling over a forest, you have two meme armies battling over each and every person's brain. And you ask like, what is the equivalent of a peace treaty, right? And the equivalent of a peace treaty is, so one, basically, in the Hobbesian case, like you have local territorial monopolies, right? And then after that, you had things like the Treaty of Westphalia, which like formalized a lot of this, and then they kept going further and further from there. Basically, saying that okay, we have this notion of territory, and within each territory, then you have a local monopoly, right? And actually, the Westphalia's example is interesting, right? Because I think. That was also when the concept of cuius regio, eius religio, right? Like he who has the region has the religion, came about, right? Basically, like one of the ideas is that kind of the local, like monarch would also have the ability to choose the religion of the country, and so it's an interesting example to harken back to because we're basically saying like even back then, it kind of like recognize that like this concept of like one person having hegemony over a piece of territory and then different people having hegemony over different pieces of territory is something that applies to physical war, and it's also something that can in the same way apply to information war, right? And so the way that this works in the space of information war is basically like, okay, you have one country, and in this one country you're supposed to but the only memes that are allowed to spread are the Xi Jinping thought memes, and you have another country, and then in that other country, the only memes that are allowed to spread are some different memes, and in the third country, you have some different memes that are allowed to spread, right? And you have this kind of equilibrium where basically you don't have at least as much zero-sum mimetic warfare because for every country, there is like one dominant elite that like has a reliable hold over the meme war, right? And there might be other groups that want to get their memes out into the meme war, but they're just like so much less powerful than the dominant party that like it's it's like the U.S. government versus like random cultists in Texas or whatever, right? That like the second group has no chance, and so most of the time they don't try, and so there's no bloodshed. So that's kind of the analogy that I made between I wouldn't say authoritarianism, though it's a very related concept. I would say like info hegemony as opposed to info pluralism might be one of the ways to think about it, and how things ended up turning out with physical warfare. And so basically, one of the things that this thesis then implies is that if there is this analogy, then if we want to argue that info pluralism is something that's actually better than info hegemony, then we might want to look for deep and enduring reasons why physical war and meme war actually are different from each other.
Okay, so Vitalik, you were just framing things in kind of this Hobbesian world where we have this anarchy of information because the cost to produce information has been very cheap. And the only remedy is that we have some sort of centralized monopoly on information, almost like a ministry of truth, right? That's the force that will bring equilibrium and cure the anarchy, right? And so that's the idea here. Noah, could you make the jump for us? Because I'm still not clear on the jump between, you said the internet may have possibly brought this about. And so the cost of information, the price to create information has maybe plummeted, or the cost to distribute information has plummeted. Why is the cost to distribute, propagate information going down? Why does that help totalitarian types of regimes and ministries of truth? That link is not quite clear, I think, in the case we've made so far.
All right. So there's a cell phone maybe in your pocket or close to you right now. Unless you've taken extraordinary precautions, that cell phone transmits information, records information about your entire life, everything you do, everything you buy, everything you search for, everyone you talk to, everything you say to people online. Maybe in real life too, if it is sneaky enough, but certainly online, where you are day to day, minute to minute. That cell phone, that little brick knows everything about you. And so what can that tell someone? Well, if you're a large corporation, or if you're a government who owns a bunch of large corporations or a government, it can tell you what you'd like to buy. It can mine your data and say, oh, I think this guy really likes broccoli now. maybe I'll go produce some broccoli. So that can aggregate information about what you want, right? So of course it can do it in the Hayekian way, right? In Hayek, you need prices, right? How do you know whether people like broccoli? You look at price data. If the price of broccoli goes up, that means maybe people like broccoli more now. But on your phone, you can see exactly who liked broccoli, when they bought broccoli, what they were doing when they bought broccoli, whether they were talking about broccoli, whether they searched for broccoli, blah, blah, blah. You can get a lot of information about that. And that's information that you couldn't get in 1957. That's information you couldn't get in 1995. And that's information that's now available.
Noah, can I just like regurgitate that just to make sure I totally understand? The way that I wasn't trained in as an economist like you were, but just like as a meme, I always understood like, why did communism fail? Oh, because like central planning is inefficient, right? It just doesn't have the information that a free market capitalistic market has. But I think what you're saying is like there's such a strong centralization of information due to modern technology that all of a sudden like central planning perhaps has a lot more of information that it previously would not have had thanks to technology. I think that's just like what you're saying in a short way.
Right. And the hypothesis here is that it's gone from being, say, 20% as good as free markets to being 60% as good as free markets. It's still significantly worse, but the disadvantage is less. And perhaps that disadvantage is now small enough where it can be more than compensated for by advantages in other domains. That's the hypothesis. Of course, I think that personally, I was briefly a finance professor, and I think, about capital allocation, things like that. Personally, obviously whether people want to buy broccoli or not that's the classic, example, right? But if you think about productive efficiency, which companies are best? Suppose you have one country where the government is allocating money to companies and saying, okay, you can have this much funding, you can have that much funding. And another country where how much funding you get is based on, your whole bunch of investors deciding what price to value your stock at and what interest rate to charge you in the bond market, right? So, and then in the other one, you just have some banks, which are owned by the government, saying, okay, we think you're going to have good opportunities, or you get money, right? You get investment capital. And so maybe the fact that so the internet can provide the people doing, loan evaluation or whatever with massively more amounts of information about both who's buying their products and how their stuff is organized and what their technology is like, and all these things about a company that you just couldn't get that information in 1995, even if you and I know because the Japanese bureaucracy really tried, and MIDI was constantly behind the curve on this, and they were the best of the best. Back in the 90s, they were just racking up one L after another doing this. And of course, when the Japanese economy thrived, it was often, because people just went around MIDI. Sometimes MIDI did have some big successes, but that's another topic. And that was mostly earlier. But then, so I guess the idea is that maybe the internet, the massive amounts of data. When we say the internet, we don't just mean like people arguing on Twitter, right? We don't just mean people podcasting like we're doing now. We also mean things like the massive data collection. So the amount of data about buying behaviors and demand and what people are doing with their work day, and whether people are productive and all these things, and about who has what technology in their company. The amount of information is vastly greater. We store massive amounts of information. So databasing is really the thing here. And so databasing, and then the fact that it's all networked means that you can transmit it easily, but, you can run regressions on it too. We have much more information about what companies are doing, how they do it, and what they might be able to do in the future than we did 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so an authoritarian state might be able to use that to allocate capital, say that before they were only 20% as good at allocating capital as a, market economy. Let's say now they're 60% as good at allocating capital as a market economy. Well, that has significantly eroded their disadvantage. They're still disadvantaged. Maybe markets are still the best, and Hayek's still formally right, but the difference has shrunk to the point where authoritarian states' other strengths that were always there can now shine through more. So that's the worry. I don't think this is true necessarily. I just think it's worth thinking and worrying about. I don't think any of this is true. I'm making a case here. I'm being a bit of a lawyer for this idea because I don't really strongly believe that this is right. And I also think that I fervently hope that in 20 years we'll be saying, well, that's why Xi Jinping's, regime collapsed because, obviously liberal democracies are much better. I hope we're saying that. I want to be able to say that in 20 years, but I don't know. Standing right here, I don't know what's going to happen. And so I'm sort of pushing this scary idea so that we can think about it. So this is the hypothesis.
If you enjoyed all of that, then you'll absolutely love the Bankless newsletter. Join over 300,000 fellow readers, all for free. Click below to sign up.